Shabbat Shalom, everybody.
Shabbat Shalom.
I want to tell a story about the stand-up comedian Dave Chappelle. And for those who aren't familiar, it's actually important to know, for the purposes of this story, that Dave Chappelle is black. He has a bit on the opioid crisis, which is very sharp, very funny. You can see it on YouTube after Shabbat if you like. So it starts out with someone trying to inform him how serious the opioid crisis is. And by the way, like most comedians, he'll take a very serious issue and make fun of it or make light of it in order to help us think more deeply about it or examine it from a different angle. So he says he's having this conversation with someone who's white, who says it's a serious crisis and communities are being broken by it and families are being destroyed, and it's a health crisis that will require monumental help from many, many fields to repair. And he says, that all sounds very familiar to me, because we had a crisis in my community in the 1980s called the crack crisis, and I have the perfect solution for your opioid crisis. You don't need big help from the government. Here's what you do. Just say no. Right? Like, ouch, right? And then he goes on to say, I have no sympathy for white people going through the opioid crisis because they had no sympathy for the black community. And so I don't know when I'm watching this whether to laugh because he's spot on in some ways, it's funny, or whether to cry because of both his lack of empathy and the lack of empathy that he felt his community experienced during the crack crisis. I think that's one of the themes of the cycle of plagues that we read last week and this week. It's a cautionary tale about what happens to our society when we stop being able to feel compassion for other people. Now, for the purposes of this sermon, I'd like you to see the Egyptians as an allegory or an archetype of someone who lacks compassion, not a race of people. There were no Egyptians hurt in the making of this sermon, right? They're a metaphor. They're a metaphor. In Shemot chapter 10, verse 5, we get to the 8th plague, the locusts. They shall cover the surface of the land, and no one will be able to see the land. Even Ezra pipes in and says, well, that's not exactly true. It's not that no one will be able to see the land. It's that the Egyptians won't be able to see the land. Why? Because the Jews in Goshen, in their territory, they're not experiencing locusts covering everything. But furthermore, says Ibn Ezra, the Egyptians never saw. That was their problem. They couldn't see that their consumption of slave labor caused so much damage. They refused to look. They had no compassion to understand how their needs affected another people. Then the Ibn Ezra continues, and he says, furthermore, the plague of locusts came a long time after the plague of hail. Why? Because God showed signs of compassion. He had allowed sproutlings to come out after the hail. There was hope that there would be a crop of food. He was enticing the Egyptians to be compassionate. He was hopeful that they would put a stop to everything, but here's their response when they hear about the plague of locusts. They go to Pharaoh, and the courtiers say, how long shall this one be a snare for us? Let the men go worship their God. Are you not aware that Egypt is lost? Not, oh, we see the light. We see the pain that we've caused the Israelites. No, this story is still being told from their perspective. We are suffering, they say. So God brings darkness, and not only darkness, but a darkness that can be felt. My friend, Rabbi Lawrence Rosenthal, he said when we were studying this passage, God seems to be saying, all right, I get it. You can't see the pain you're causing. Maybe I can make you feel it. Maybe I can send you a darkness that can be felt. But it doesn't work. And so we're faced with the last attempt God makes to teach empathy. Remember, of course, it's all an allegory in this particular sermon. And God says, you can't see the damage you've caused. You can't feel any empathy. I have to make you feel something. I want you to know what it feels like when your children die. And even that doesn't do it for the Egyptians, because when they finally release the Israelites, they are so bent on using them for labor that they chase them into the sea, even to their own death. Their lack of empathy literally kills them. And by the way, we have a midrash that takes place at that scene that we'll read next week on the shores of the sea. The Israelites burst into song. In fact, we sing it 3 times a day. Twice. Right? And we have a midrash that God's voice thunders out of the heavens, and he says, what do you think you're doing? How can you sing? How can you celebrate at a moment like this when my creation lies at the bottom of the sea? Have you no compassion? And they stop singing. We've been working through Daf Yomi in our community, and earlier this month, we read a story about compassion that was a completely different paradigm, a really beautiful one. Rabbi Yochanan goes to visit his friend, Rabbi Elazar, who's fallen ill. Rabbi Yochanan was a magical fellow, and one of his magical properties was that his skin glowed. So when Rabbi Yochanan arrives at his friend's house, it's dark in the room, and he rolls up his sleeve to shine a light because he wants to see his fellow's pain. He wants to empathize and understand what is happening. And Rabbi Yochanan, by the way, was sick on the previous daf, and his teacher, Rabbi Hanina, came to visit him and help him get well. So he learned a lesson of empathy. Anyway, Rabbi Yochanan sits down with his friend, Rabbi Elazar, and they have a conversation about what's really bothering Rabbi Elazar. It turns out it's not a physical illness. He's depressed. It's a mental state of being, a spiritual lowness. And so he listens to his friend, and after a while he says, well, are your sufferings welcome to you? And Rabbi, in other words, is this working for you to be in the dark room miserable? And Rabbi Elazar says, no. So Rabbi Yochanan says, well, give me your hand. And he helps his friend stand up and walk out of the sick house. Totally different paradigm because he sees and feels his friend's pain. If the plagues are a metaphor for that aspect of human nature that can't feel empathy, then they point to the fact that when we lack compassion for others, it leads to not only destruction, but self-destruction. I started talking about the comedian Dave Chappelle, and the routine is very funny, and it's clever, but it's also heartbreaking because it lacks empathy, both his for those experiencing the tragedies of the opioid crisis and the scars that were left on his community when people didn't help in a way that was adequate during the crack crisis. You know who Dave Chappelle reminded me of in that moment? Pharaoh. Because when the book of Exodus opens up, Pharaoh has a real crisis on his hands. He has an epidemic of too many Israelites. And what they tell us, the word to describe Pharaoh there is he was shrewd. He wanted to deal with the Israelites shrewdly. He came up with a plan that enslaved them and created genocide. And it was a smart plan. The problem wasn't that the plan lacked intelligence, because it did deal with his problem. The problem was that the solution to the epidemic completely lacked compassion. We can justify a lot of human suffering by making very clever, intelligent arguments. It's been done throughout Jewish history. Let's just walk through our own genocides. Amalek, Babylon, Rome, Inquisition. Sorry, I skipped over the Crusades, Inquisition, pogroms, Shoah. And that list would be a lot longer, right, if I listed all the genocides of the world, not just ours. And every one of those genocides, guess what? It was led by a very intelligent leader who completely lacked compassion, had no ability to see or feel the pain of other human beings. So perhaps the plague comes and tells the story in terms of the Egyptians, so that it doesn't hit too close to home. And maybe in this sort of winding way, it asks us to consider the moments that we have caused destruction and even self-destruction when we have not been able to show compassion. Shabbat Shalom.